Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana Campero, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COFECE. Mexico's Congress passed a major and controversial constitutional reform, which made Mexico the only country in the whole world to have its entire judicial branch stand for election, including the Supreme Court. However, it will fall on the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, to design and pass all the secondary laws necessary to implement these reforms. To discuss the importance of these changes and the potential impact they will have not only on the rule of law, but also on the US-Mexico commercial and investment relations, that it is truly my pleasure to welcome Alejandra Palacios, former head of Mexico's antitrust agency, COFECE, and Andrea Durkin, Vice President for International Policy at the National Association of U.S. Manufacturers. Andrea, welcome to Mexico Matters. Hanna, welcome back. It is my pleasure to have you both on this show today. Hanna, can you please explain what is truly at the core of these reforms and why are they so controversial?
First of all, Mariana, thank you very much for this invitation. Andrea, it's a pleasure to be here with you. So what happened in the past weeks is that Mexico approved Congress and state legislators, because this is a constitutional reform, they approved what we call in Mexico the judicial reform. This reform has several aspects, but I think two are important to mention specifically. The first one is that all judges at the federal and state level, including Supreme Court judges, will be elected by popular vote. So we Mexicans in 2025 and 2026 will go out and vote for all judges in all matters.
We're talking, like 7,000 judges?
Yes, we're talking about 7,000 judges. So the risk there is twofold. On the one hand, is like there's this logistical thing on how are we going to vote for 7,000 judges and how will ballots look?
God.
Yeah, so judges they're placed in different parts of the country, but how judges are placed is different from traditional electoral sites. So it's not that you just organize like a presidential election, but instead of choosing a president and Congress, you choose judges. I mean, the geographic areas are very different. So there's a logistical issue there. Apart from Mexico being with Bolivia and maybe somewhere else, the only country where the population elects all judges. And then complementary to that is that in the Constitution, they sort of wrote down what the requests are to be a judge. And those requests are very low. So the judiciary system in Mexico is not perfect. There is a difference between local judiciary and federal judiciary. And one of those differences has to do with the fact that at the federal level, there is a judicial career, or there was until this reform. So judges, you have a career, and as a public servant, you need to have several qualifications to move up in the ladder. And so that has also, or will be dismantled, thank you, with a reform. So what worries us Mexicans, and I guess it also worries international investors in Mexico, is that the judiciary and all judicial procedures might become politicized in a way, and also the quality of those judges could be very low.
God, Bolivia is certainly not a great example of democracy and the rule of law. And Mexico's judicial system is far from perfect either. Are we heading in the wrong direction, Hanna?
Yeah, so what will happen now, Mariana, is that secondary laws will be written. What happens in Mexico, and I guess everywhere, is once you modify the constitution, then as a second step, you have to change all the norms and regulations and acts that are related to that matter. So in the next 3-4 months, we'll see how that constitutional reform unfolds in regulations. So we'll have more clarity on how logistically you will go and vote and what are specifically the requirements to be a judge. I don't know, like to head a specialized courts. In Mexico, there's antitrust specialized courts, for example. So there will be specific requirements for that, to be a Supreme Court justice. So that we will see in secondary laws. But I mean, once something is written in the Constitution, it's very difficult to deviate from what the Constitution says. So we're sort of expecting that we're going to lose, as I said, quality in the rulings. And we could see that judges get appointed because they're close.
Politically. I mean, it'll be political.
Exactly. Right. And then the consequence of that is that you lose independence in the judiciary system.
Hanna, as part of López Obrador's reform is also the notion of integrating key regulatory bodies into the various federal ministries, right? Which could eliminate the independence and even the budget of those regulating competition, key markets such as energy or telecom, as well as those that ensure transparency, privacy, among others. Why are these bodies so important, and why incorporating them into the executive branch or other respective ministries would be a bad idea?
Yes. So as you say, Mariana, there's this proposal and it's ready to be voted in the Chamber of Deputies. So we're only waiting to see when, which seeks to eliminate these regulatory bodies that you mentioned: competition, energy, telecom, transparency, data privacy, and returning those powers to the executive branch. What is also interesting, or worrisome, I would say, and creates uncertainty, is that it's not clear yet how these functions would be structured within their respective ministries. So, for example, the antitrust agency functions will go into the Ministry of Commerce. The energy regulator functions will go into the Ministry of Energy. They're creating a new agency for telecom and digital matters, so it might go in there or into the Ministry of Communications. But exactly how, we don't know. We don't know if it will be part of a directorate, or it will be they will maintain sort of the agency structure, but within the ministry. So that will also eventually be unfold in the secondary laws, but that is a process that goes after these reforms get approved, if they get approved. So what is important to say about this is that at the heart, what we're seeing is the executive branch, and now Congress, because the same party, Morena, controls the executive branch and has a supermajority in Congress. They want to eliminate those agencies that have acted in the AMLO's government as sort of checks and balances. So the AMLO administration has tried to lessen competition in the energy sector, for example. And so the energy regulator and the antitrust regulator complicate that function. And in general, the idea is that the executive branch has, at the end of the day, the powers to regulate markets and sort of decide how they function. And I mean, these bodies were established between the years from what Mexico signed the NAFTA agreement until the 2000s, because of several reasons. We wanted, as a Mexican society, to provide legal certainty and stability to markets, to attract foreign investors, because we were signing the North American Free Trade Agreement, to fill gaps within government, because markets have been getting complicated and regulation with time has gotten more sophisticated, because it was backed by recommendations from the international organizations. But I mean, regardless of those specific motivations, what Mexico wanted to do, or the message it was wanting to convey, is that it was strengthening its regulatory institutions to build confidence and certainty for long-term investments. So this is exactly going the other way around, exactly in the opposite direction. And
basically what it does is it eliminates all the checks to the superpower of the president.
It's sort of, between the judiciary and between this, I would say that institutional guardrails are being dismantled. And now the opposition is also dismantled. So basically, the opposition of the executive branch right now will be Morena. What happens within Morena, the relationship with the Claudia Sheinbaum, the incoming president, and López Obrador, who's leaving government, and of course markets and our international trading partners. But the national guardrails, institutional guardrails that worked as checks and balances for the executive branch are being dismantled as we speak, yes.
Andrea, if markets and our international partners will become key checks and balances, maybe even the only ones, of all the scenarios described by Hannah, what concerns you, U.S. manufacturers and investors the most?
Well, first, I want to just thank you, Mariana, for having me on your podcast. And it's really quite an honor to be here alongside Alejandra. So thank you for that. And
my pleasure.
Also, just by way of background on the NAM, I wanted to, for your listeners, just explain that our association represents 14,000 different member companies. And those member companies range from small businesses to large global leaders, and in every industrial sector encompassing heavy machinery, automotive, chemical, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, you name it. And they manufacture in every state in the United States, representing 13 million different employees. But for the purposes of this conversation, I really wanted to emphasize that our companies have longstanding and deep relationships with Mexico, whether that's through their direct investments in their own production or through relationships with suppliers and producers in Mexico. And most of the time, it's both of those scenarios. So among the scenarios that you just described, what concerns us the most, we're absolutely concerned about the broad uncertainty that's now been injected into the judicial system. But we're also keeping a very close eye on any changes, as you just described, to Mexico's independent regulatory authorities, particularly in telecommunications and energy, the Hydrocarbons Commission, the Energy Regulatory Commission, the Federal Telecom Institute. These two sectors are really critical backbone sectors for the Mexican economy. They're sectors where our companies are heavily invested, and they're sectors that serve the rest of our companies that operate in Mexico. And in energy, in particular, we're concerned about preferential treatment that would be granted for state-owned enterprises that don't have to operate on commercial terms. We're concerned about outright prohibitions on certain types of foreign investments, such as fracking or open pit mining. And Alejandra said it, very eloquently. In telecommunications, it's a great example of where Mexico made important, really seminal reforms about a decade ago. And at the center of those reforms was the creation of the independent regulatory body to promote competition, and by promoting competition, to expand access to broadband while bringing down the cost to consumers and to businesses trying to increase their productivity. And it was such an important commitment. You referenced this, Alejandra. It was such an important commitment that it was enshrined in the USMCA in provisions that were designed to protect competition in Mexico's telecom sector specifically by ensuring that Mexico retain and maintain an independent regulator. So there are other aspects, certainly, to what the independent regulator does, like working to lower spectrum fees and other things that really inject competition into the marketplace. And by rolling back the independent regulator, you might be rolling back progress, societal-wide progress, and the benefits for companies, and see a reversion really to anti-competitive practices in these sectors, and from our perspective, potentially squeeze our U.S. companies out of the market.
Hannah, if getting rid of independent regulators, as Andrea said, could squeeze U.S. companies out of the market, What tools are critical for these agencies to have in order to protect their independence? I remember a few years ago when the president accused the Antitrust Commission that you headed of trying to block his efforts to favor Pemex and the CFE. Can you tell us a bit about how you managed to go against the presidency and what tools did you have back then that will be critical for regulators to continue to have in the future?
As Andrea was saying, what the Mexican government was trying to do in the past, 20 years was to create certainty in terms of bringing investment and creation of infrastructure, and telecommunication networks is exactly the example of that. So what worries if you bring these agencies back into government is that instead of taking technical decisions in terms of how do you regulate those markets, or how do you introduce competition, or if you authorize a merger, or all those types of things that are natural dynamics in the government, is that instead of doing that, you have the own government favoring, as Andrea said, Mexican state-owned companies. The example we've already lived is the president wanting to favor the Mexican state-owned electricity utility company, which is CFE. When you're a public servant, Mariana, your obligation is to apply the laws that are at that moment in effect. So what the Constitution of Mexico says still, and what the secondary laws say still, in the energy sector and in the electricity sector in particular, is that private industries can't generate electricity, and then there's like certain rules on how that electricity gets into the grid. And so if you're very competitive and you produce electricity at a low price, your electricity will enter the grid first. And CFE, which is the electricity state utility company, stayed back and started producing energy at a higher cost. So more than ownership, it started losing market participation, so market share. So the president didn't like that. So they came out with certain rulings that said basically they would decide who would make their electricity enter into the grid. First, yeah. And who second, and maybe certain private participants, even though they produce electricity at low prices, they would never get their electricity into the grid because they were not the companies the government wanted to favor. They wanted to favor first CFE and then others.
So it was not about the market at all.
No. There were rules, and the rules said, and the rules are still in effect, is that making the electricity enter the grid is done by a competitive process. In the Mexican Constitution, there's a proceeding that is called constitutional controversy, to refers to a legal dispute between different branches of government where the constitutionality of a law or a regulation is in question because one of those powers is not complying with the Constitution. So once you file a constitutional controversy, it's the Supreme Court who resolves. So what we did at that moment at the antitrust agency, when the government didn't like private regulators producing electricity at low prices and getting that electricity into the grid, they created certain regulation that hindered or made very, very complicated for private companies to get their electricity into the grid. So we used this constitutional controversy and we said, there's an action by the government, by the executive branch, which is not complying with the Constitution because the Constitution says, and all the laws say, that the private sector can participate, and the way you get electricity into the grid is by a competitive process. So that's really all we did. And with that controversy also came several amparos.
And the Supreme Court upheld that controversy, right?
The Supreme Court did not declare that what the government was doing was unconstitutional, because you need 8 votes from, it's a very technical thing, but you need 8 votes, and they only had 7 votes of ministers, 7 out of 11 saying that it was unconstitutional. They didn't say it was legal, but they didn't say it was illegal. But in the amparos the companies filed, saying what they're doing is unconstitutional, the court did tell that the regulation they emitted and then the secondary laws they emitted, they were unconstitutional. That parts of the laws were unconstitutional. So, I mean, sort of that's part of the story of why we're here, because it was first the antitrust agencies telling the government what you're doing is unconstitutional. So that's a check and balance. And then it was the Supreme Court saying, yes, the regulations you emitted as an executive branch and then in the Congress, those are unconstitutional. And it's interesting that after the Supreme Court made that filing in amparos, the president presented these reforms. I mean, it's all part of this. It's the president wanting to be the final decision maker in who participates in the electricity market, in the telecom market, and in general, how competitive markets can be. So he likes that discretionary, and that's what he's looking for. And that's sort of like the big framework that explains all this that we're living in Mexico. And of course, it generates tons of uncertainty because when you have a regulator and you have a technical professional team deciding what to do, like everybody sort of knows what the technical rules are and what to abide to. You might not like the regulation, but it's very clear and you know the rules and what you have to abide to. Right now, the uncertainty is huge because it's the executive branch who will have the final word, and we don't even know how those secondary laws will look like.
Yes, López Obrador really never liked the Supreme Court to intervene, and even less when they denied his desires. Andrea, in order for Mexico to be able to continue to expand its manufacturing base, we really need clean, abundant, and competitive energy. Yet, in the last years, Mexico's emissions have risen, while US and Canada's have decreased. How are US manufacturers coping with Mexico's reversals in the energy sector? And how do you anticipate they will adapt to this uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, let me make a general comment on the energy sector because, going back again to the previous energy reforms, those were really seen as a significant opportunity for increased electricity and natural gas trade between our countries. U.S. natural gas exports to Mexico were on the rise, and that was in Mexico's interest, due to declining domestic production. But the proposed constitutional changes could disrupt any of those positive trends with regard to deeper integration between the U.S. and Mexican natural gas markets in particular. And it could certainly limit productive competition in the energy sector by giving priority and favor and advantage to the SOE over the private sector, by giving control to the state over power projects, and really by extension, reducing opportunities for the U.S. private sector, including, as you mentioned, in the area of renewables. So this is potentially going to have a very dampening effect on those positive trends. Just to widen the lens out as well, I mean, the broader issue here is also that we're very concerned that some of these changes constitute violations to the USMCA. So there's all of this domestic dynamic, competition in the marketplace within Mexico, but some of those violate obligations and rights under the USMCA. And that's a problem in and of itself, but we're also in 2026 looking at a review among the three governments. And I think that these actions and the consequences of these actions could certainly put at risk renewal of the USMCA itself, while also harming the standing of Mexico as an attractive place to expand commercial relationships. And we talk a lot about nearshoring, and Mexico is certainly an attractive destination for nearshoring, but these actions could really, and the uncertainty generated by the judicial reform could certainly dissuade new or increased capital investments, which poses a risk to Mexico's standing as probably the number one destination for nearshoring, including in the energy sector.
Before I ask you about USMCA and about its renewal in 2026, let me ask you about U.S. investments in Mexico. According to media reports, there are about $95 billion in U.S. investments just waiting to see what will happen with these reforms. Is it your sense, Andrea, that U.S. businesses are waiting in the sidelines, or actually are they taking their money elsewhere?
It's a great question. It's a very relevant question. I started in this job just a few months ago. I've had meetings with some 70, 75 companies. And I am hearing that from most of them. But let's start with the baseline. The trade in both goods and services between the U.S. and Mexico reached $900 billion in 2023. And that's a reflection of integrated manufacturing. A lot of U.S. goods exports, probably a third of that is industrial supplies and materials going into further production in Mexico. And to your question, the stock of U.S. investment in Mexico is also reaching new heights, reached about $144 billion in 2023. And you mentioned the number that's kind of maybe waiting in the wings. I think all of that increased investment over the last few years is certainly a testament to the upgrading of USMCA, which strengthened investor confidence. But the future investment, including a lot of what you described, is probably expansion in existing investments, and none of that is guaranteed. So manufacturers are definitely paying attention to the impacts of the constitutional amendments. They're also watching how the banks are factoring these potential changes into Mexico's risk profile, and they're waiting to see what stance President Sheinbaum will take. So I do hear that companies are moving with a bit of caution with regard to their investment decisions right now, maybe holding off and delaying those decisions.
Andrea spoke about the importance of having independent regulators in the telecom sector as well. In fact, she said that its importance is such that it was actually enshrined in USMCA. Hannah, are you concerned about what could happen with the trade agreement if regulators are de facto dismantled?
I would say several things. One, regarding Mexico's commitments under the USMCA agreement. We don't know yet, at least that's my view, if these reforms will eventually go against our commitments or not. And it's a tricky thing because, Chapter 21 talks about independence and impartiality of competition authorities. And so there, what it says is that all of these countries require fair, equitable processes and due legal procedures. But that could be done within a ministry or without a ministry. The DOJ antitrust section is within the ministry. So it's the secondary law who will eventually tell us what will happen there. So that's why I talk more about uncertainty than of things that have already materialized. Chapter 22 talks about competitive neutrality, which is particularly concerning when you have state-owned enterprises. So like if the antitrust agency loses independence, as we said, competition oversight on SOE companies may become less stringent. And what's been happening these years is that the Mexican government has had more participation in markets. So traditionally we had energy SOEs, Pemex and CFE. Now we have CFE Telecom. And then we have also a backbone company in Mexico, which is controlled by government, which is called Altlan. And then we have airports. We have several airports that now participate in the market. For example, there's a new airport in Tulum that competes with an airport in Cancun. And then also the government initiated operations of an airline company, Mexicana de Aviación. So this competitive neutrality becomes more difficult to apply when the government has more participation in more markets. So that's also a thing to see. Again, we'll see that in the secondary laws. And then specifically Chapter 18, which is about telecommunication and requires an independent, not subordinate to service providers, antitrust agency. So, there's a possibility that those commitments will fail, but there's also the possibility that something will eventually get fixed in secondary laws if these reforms pass. And so in terms of investment, that was your initial question, Mariana. Investments, I think, do like that there's a USMCA in force. So, we'll see that discussion a little bit further. And then also, Mariana, I think it's important for our public to know, for example, all merger transactions in Mexico are subject to COFECE's authorization, which is the antitrust agency. And if the antitrust agency goes within the Ministry of Commerce and it's used to favor friendly companies and national champions, that could, be difficult for international money pouring into Mexico. in 2023, nearly 52 of all the operations the antitrust agency saw were related to foreign entities looking to establish their operations in Mexico. So if you think that the merger procedure is going to favor national champions, for example, you might decide that it's very difficult to enter a market. That's sort of like a very concrete example of what could happen if you lose independence of the antitrust agency. But again, as I say, all these are possibilities. All these will depend, if these reforms pass, on how, as you say, how these land in secondary laws. But I mean, the uncertainty it's creating is huge.
Andrea, as Hannah said, the rule of law is the bedrock of trade agreements. The NAM actually has stated that these reforms would put the trade relationship at serious risk. USMCA is up for review, as we know, in 2026. And when that happens, I assume U.S. businesses will pressure the U.S. government, whether it is Trump or Harris, to protect their own investments and to uphold Mexico to abide by its commitments. Will they advocate with the U.S. government to force Mexico to abide so that the 2026 review doesn't become a new renegotiation or maybe even worse than that?
Yeah, I mean, Alejandra described some of the commitments in USMCA that are designed to promote competition. There's also a lot in there that talks about protections for all investors across all three countries. We're entitled to national treatment. We're entitled to a minimum standard of treatment. There's commitments on how you govern, SOEs are governed. There's a variety of things in there that are relevant to this conversation. But I think taking a step back, it just can't be overstated how important the USMCA is to undergird our economic relationship within North America. We have always had bilateral disputes. And we look to the agreement and we look to the provisions of the agreement and the mechanisms under the agreement that are designed to help us navigate through them. And our region, as North America, is the most competitive in the world because of the agreement that helps us grow trade and investment flows among our three countries as part of integrated manufacturing that's been taking place for decades. So this relationship has really never been more important, not only for our competitiveness in general, but think about the challenges we face in the global economy. If we are stronger as a region, more competitive as a region, we can help navigate those global challenges better. So the NAM and our companies, this is a number one issue for most of our members, is the USMCA and the preservation of USMCA. And so the NAM will absolutely be at the forefront and already is advocating for a productive and a smooth review of the USMCA in July 2026. But we also think there's a lot more that our three governments could be doing together to cooperate to unlock the benefits, the full benefits of the USMCA, whether that's regulatory cooperation or facilitating goods at our borders, or discussing regional energy security. And so we should be discussing how we enhance our collective commercial resiliency in collaborative ways that go beyond the specific commitments in USMCA, but also respects and preserves the commitments within USMCA that have gotten us to this point. So we intend to bring those conversations, those broader conversations on, as I said, the infrastructure, on trade facilitation, on energy, on all those things forward, because the NAM represents manufacturing in all sectors and across the entire supply chain within those sectors. And all of those things are essential to our broad competitiveness, with USMCA sitting at the heart of it. So we'd really like to see the three governments renew the agreement smoothly, but also go beyond that and talk about how we collaborate in those other areas.
Hannah, with the new judicial system in Mexico, one, as you've said, that will be less independent. Do you foresee international companies using international arbitration mechanism much more rather than using the Mexican courts to resolve their own disputes? How would this work, and in what cases?
So foreign investors under the USMCA, they have this procedure, that is sort of expedite, transparent, and reliable. So many people say that disputes between investors and Mexico and the States, or US or Canada and Mexico, will be solved through this process, which is called investor state dispute settlement. And so that they should not be that worried of what is happening in Mexico. I think that's sort of like a very comfortable argument, but not necessarily real, because before you start this international dispute, you need to show that there's an impact, and you need to go, there's like an internal process where you do go through the Mexican judiciary. So eventually you will go to this like international arbitrage procedure, but what happens at the local level will have an effect at the initiation of that process. So the reform does or could affect international investors, even if they're investing under the USMCA umbrella. And then locally, there are talks about arbitration. If you think that the judiciary system is politicized and that their decisions are not independent, then you could use arbitration as a mechanism to solve problems between Mexicans, like things happening in Mexico. And also what's important to bear in mind there is that not every legal issue can use arbitrage procedures. For example, if you have a tax issue, you can't resolve tax issues through arbitration. So arbitration might be used more, but it's sort of...
Yeah, it's not going to be the solution for everything.
Yeah, it's not like the silver bullet. And then also, right. What's also saddening about that argument is that if you have money and you can pay lawyers and you can go into an arbitrage procedure, then you'll resolve one way or the other a judiciary conflict you have. But what happens with the majority of the Mexican population who don't have access to those mechanisms? So maybe a big Mexican company or an international company in Mexico that has access to lawyers and to the USMCA will find a way out. But as I say, it's not the silver bullet.
Andrea, having to go through international arbitration would certainly add to the cost of doing business in Mexico, right? Will U.S. manufacturers see this increase not only in cost, but also in uncertainty, and then see Mexico less competitive and even less attractive?
I think that's right. And, when we first started learning about the judicial reforms, it's hard to argue about a hypothetical, what might happen in the marketplace. But now we have some evidence, actually, that companies are going to be stuck here without the recourse that they might like. We have a member company. It's been in the news recently, called Vulcan Materials Company.
Yeah.
And it's an Alabama-based construction company, as you know, and they've been developing a quarry and building out a port for decades. And they were basically stripped of control of their assets through actions that were recently finalized and announced by AMLO's government. And what you saw, so that company now is stuck between a rock and a hard place. Is probably a bad phrase to use, given that it's a quarry. But now you've seen, right? But now you've seen also congressional reaction to that. So this week, Senators Kane and Haggerty, Britt, Tuberville, Barrasso, and Budd, they introduced a Senate companion bill called the Defending American Property Abroad Act. And the legislation would prohibit vessels from entering a U.S. port if they had previously used a port or land or infrastructure that had been illegally seized by a foreign nation in the Western Hemisphere. So, and it requires other things. It also would require the USTR to report to Congress on how expropriations would be addressed. Coming back to the review, how would USTR address expropriations in the USMCA review? So the problem is no longer hypothetical, and Vulcan isn't the only foreign company actually that has sought legal recourse after government interventions where major projects have been canceled and the like. So we do have examples in practice now of what companies feared would happen with impunity once federal judges may be elected. How do they pursue their rights necessarily in those courts? Because we may have removed the check on government that was previously there. So this is just one very big, high-profile example of the manifestation of concerns that companies now have.
This concrete example that Andrea is putting in the table has to do with a relationship between a government and a particular. So they can go into, investor state dispute settlements. And so they have that pathway. But truth be said is that the majority of international or trade commerce relations are between privates. So there are private contracts. So that you cannot use the investor state dispute settlement between private contracts. So that's, sort of like stuck in Mexico with the judicial system.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this episode. And so far, this conversation has made me a bit pessimistic. But let me ask you, Hannah, how are you feeling? Are you optimistic? Do you believe the new president, Claudia, will actually be able to take these reforms and write certainty into the secondary laws and comply with USMCA as well?
I don't want to be pessimistic. I just want to be realistic. That's why I've been saying there's a lot of uncertainty, and we'll know many things as they unfold. It's on President Sheinbaum's term that the secondary laws for the judiciary reform will unfold, will be put in place. It's going to be now on President Sheinbaum's term and Congress if the reforms we've talked about regarding independent regulators are voted, and if they are voted, how those secondary laws will be unfolded. So the uncertainty is there. I really do hope that under Claudia's guidance, the secondary laws unfold as nicely as possible. What is true is that Morena Party has supermajority in Congress, as we said, and so they could write the secondary laws as they want. They don't have to negotiate with any stakeholders. I do hope that Claudia Sheinbaum opens those conversations to different stakeholders. So in that sense, I would say I would be optimistic in terms of opening those conversations with stakeholders and landing those secondary laws as best as possible to comply with the USMCA, to protect the Mexican judiciary system, and to protect international investments coming into Mexico.
Andrea, what will need to happen in order for that U.S. investment to come into Mexico?
Well, I think companies are still very bullish, but as you've laid out here, the changes that are being contemplated now will have significant political and economic impact on the country and on U.S.-Mexico commercial relations for years to come. So I would just echo what Alejandra said, which is that from our perspective, we would really appreciate the opportunity with the Sheinbaum administration to engage interested stakeholders to talk about the potential impacts on domestic companies, on trading partners, particularly in the areas that are covered by USMCA, and to open those lines of dialogue and work with us as she implements these changes, and maybe perhaps slow the roll on some of the things that haven't been put through the Congress yet, particularly when it comes to the independence of the regulatory agencies, and really work with affected stakeholders on that before it happens.
Hannah, Andrea, thank you so much for this really interesting conversation. And I will just close by emphasizing the importance of when Claudia and her team will be writing those secondary laws, that if they do them well, they could actually bring some certainty back to both our partners and investors. My name is Mariana Campero. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog